Awesome, yeah, so my name's John Order. I'm a software engineer at Phenom Blue. We're actually located right over here in Exarban Village. So I do a lot of C#, .NET, also a lot of Node, front-end JavaScript, a little bit of everything, just because we have a lot of different projects, so there's a lot of variety for me, which I really enjoy. And lately I've been diving deeper into Docker, using it in some projects, and so I'm going to share what I've learned with you guys tonight. So to start off, I just want to do some hand raising just so I can get an idea of where everybody is at. Raise your hand if you would say you have like little to no experience using Docker. Is that, okay, cool, so that's the majority of the room. Is anybody using Docker at work right now, by chance? Just wondering, okay, a little bit? Cool. And then too, just for curiosity, so ASP.NET Core 1.0 hit a few weeks ago, along with .NET Core. Is anybody planning on moving to either one, like within the next year? Like on your app, are you planning on transitioning over? Does anybody have like definite plans for that? Trying? Yeah. So the main project that I'm on, we actually started with ASP.NET 5 when it was like RC1, and we started using it. And right now we're still on ASP.NET 5 RC1, and if you've been tracking along with that, you know that RC1 is quite a bit different than 1.0. They changed quite a bit of stuff in between. So even that is going to be a little bit of migration for us. But that is that. This is my contact info. I got my email and Twitter up there. If you want to check out the slides, they're up there. The code that we're going to be walking through is there as well. And then that last thing, I have a feedback form. So if after the talk, if you guys could go hit that up and fill that out for me, I'd really appreciate it. I'm trying to get out and speaking a little more, trying to improve. So if you could tell me what I did well, some things that I could improve on, I'd really appreciate that. All right. Okay. Can anybody resonate feeling like this when you're getting ready to deploy to production, deploy your web app, your ASP.NET web app? Is anybody using like a manual deployment process right now? Like you have it like a script in a Word doc, or like one person on your team knows how to deploy to production and everybody else, like if that guy's gone, you can't do anything? Yeah, I've definitely been there. And it's not fun because like you've got your development environment, you've got features or bugs that you fixed, and you're all good to go, everything's working, and then it's time to go to production, and like you're scared because you don't want to break the system, you don't want to lose data, you don't want to have downtime. Because sometimes you deploy and it just is like an outright failure. Like something that you had in development you don't have in production, and your build just breaks, and so you have to like go back to your users or your product owner, and you have to say like, whoops, my bad, let me go back and fix that. And that's embarrassing, right? Because it takes time away that you could be using to develop features or fix bugs, and now you have to spend it fixing the production build. Is anybody familiar with Heroku? It's kind of like the Azure web app where they have this, it's a platform as a service where you deploy your code to Heroku, and then they manage the scaling and all that kind of stuff for you. The people behind Heroku, the Heroku platform, they came up with these 12 best practices that they found. It's called the 12-factor app. So through their experience building Heroku and then seeing other people build things on top of Heroku, they came up with 12 best practices that they think make a successful web app or like a software as a service application. You can go check it out at 12factor.net. But the 10th one is called dev production parity, which basically means you should always try and keep your development environment and your staging and your production environments as similar as possible. It's common sense, like that, that just makes sense, but like we all know, that's not always that easy. And they identify 3 gaps that they see happen quite a bit. The first one is the tools gap, which is just different dependencies in different environments. Or like maybe you're using SQL Server 2016 on your dev machine, but then in production is still running like 2008 or older. And then the second one is the personnel gap, which basically means like I might be deploying or I might be writing the code today, but then somebody else on a different team is going to be actually deploying what I write. So then when things break or things go wrong, it's that much harder to get things going right again because they have no idea, what I was doing. And then the third one is the time gap, which means that if I'm developing a feature today, and then it's not actually going to even be deployed until 3 months from now, and that can cause problems because if I'm developing a feature, it's deployed 3 months from now, something breaks. Now I have to get like in my head where I was 3 months ago and debug what happened. So as an industry, we've come up with continuous delivery to like bridge these gaps. So I have just an example workflow, a continuous delivery workflow showing with TeamCity and Octopus Deploy. Is anybody using like TeamCity or Octopus? Or anybody familiar with those? Yeah, so TeamCity is a CI tool like Jenkins or like Visual Studio Team Services, where you push your code to your source control, it picks that up, builds a NuGet package, and then Octopus Deploy is really good at taking NuGet packages and deploying them to servers. And you can even have things like, so it'll automatically deploy new builds to staging, but then when you want to deploy to production, maybe you have to have like somebody sign off and then they hit the button, deploy to production. So we've bridged these gaps by saying, we should use continuous delivery. Our app should always be in a deployable state so that we can go from development to production as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So we should have, tests. All our tests should be green. We push, CI builds, and we go through the process. So where I want to go with this talk and where I think and what I'm really excited about using Docker is I'm really excited about using Docker in a continuous delivery workflow where you have a Docker container that you're essentially moving from your development environment to staging to production. And I know I haven't even explained really what Docker is yet, so if you're not familiar, but for now, just think of Docker as like this box where your app lives. And like everything that your app needs to run is inside this box. So that's like the OS, the .NET runtime, any databases, it's all inside this box. And when you're developing, you can kind of go inside that box. You can change source code. You can build. You can debug. You can do all those things. If you're doing TDD, you can do that. But everything's inside of a box, and it's all standardized. So then when I hand it off and I have my coworkers that are also working, they're working from the same exact environment, and we can be sure that we're working off the same code. So we can't say like, well, it works on my machine, but it doesn't work on yours. If you're doing this and you're developing inside Docker containers, ideally that problem goes away. So in this workflow, you've got your development environment and you've got your app you're developing. You push to source control, and your CI server picks that up, and it takes your Docker box, this box that you've been developing in, and it essentially like seals it off. So if you imagine like a cardboard box, like it takes tape and it puts it around so you can't change what's inside the box now. And then it pushes that into a registry, which you can think of a registry as like the warehouse where all of your boxes are sitting. And then from there, it can go to staging, and then once you run maybe some end-to-end tests, some user acceptance tests, then we can go to production. So the idea is that instead of having our development and our staging and our production, they all have to kind of know how to deal with like different versions of the .NET runtime, different versions of servers, all kinds of different stuff. All they need to depend on, or the only dependency that they need is Docker. And if my server can run Docker, then I'm good. And we can kind of draw some parallels to the shipping industry, and that's also kind of where the name Docker came from and the term container came from. So like actually way back, and up until like the 1950s, the shipping industry, when ships would come into port and they would get loaded, there was this process called break bulk shipping, where they would take like all the crates and the barrels and the sacks, and they would take them and load them onto the ship. And these are all like of varying sizes and shapes and all that. And it was a pain because you have all these, different whatever crates and barrels, and they're all different sizes. So the ships were actually sitting at port forever just trying to get loaded up, and they were spending more time at port than they were actually delivering goods. So like right after World War II, the shipping container was invented, and the shipping container optimized ship was created so that instead of having all these different sizes of crates and barrels, we can just have a shipping container. And as long as my ship, can fit, X number of shipping containers, I can just load. I have all my loaded shipping containers, load them on my ship, and I go. So you can kind of see the parallel where now Docker is like this standardized interface, where as long as my server knows how to run a Docker container, then I can have anything I want in there, and I can go from environment to environment without breaking a step. So that's that's the main idea of my talk, and that's what I'm excited about, and that's what I hope to get all of you excited about. All right. All right, so with that, I want to actually explain what Docker is. So if you're familiar with a VM, you can kind of think as Docker kind of the same idea as a virtual machine, where you have like this isolated environment where you install all the dependencies that you need to run your app. So it's the same idea, except the architecture is a little bit different, and that's why Docker has all the hype that it has today, where a VM runs on top of a hypervisor, and then you have all your guest OSs, and you have like the hardware emulation and all that kind of thing going on. The difference with containers and Docker is it's using Linux kernel features to manage all of that at the process level. So everything is isolated processes that the Docker engine and the kernel is managing. So the Linux kernel is actually really good at switching between processes and managing memory and resources in that way. And that's why Docker containers are so much faster to spin up, so much faster to tear down than VMs. And so that's an important distinction is Docker is fundamentally, it's wrapping Linux kernel technologies. So that's why natively it doesn't run on Windows, because it's using features that are in the Linux kernel. Even though Microsoft is working to get those, some of those features into Windows Server, they're not there yet. So essentially what Docker is doing is it's just wrapping these features that have been in the kernel for a few years now to do containers. It's just wrapping those and making those easier to use. So things like namespaces, cgroups, union file systems, they've been in the Linux kernel, and people that know how to use these have been able to create containers, but it just it wasn't very widespread until Docker came along and built this whole ecosystem and made it easier to use. So this is the ecosystem that we have around Docker now. So Docker, the company, has built these tools and these products around containerization. So on the left are some of the products. The first one I want to point out is Hub. Think of that, it's basically like GitHub for Docker images. So it's a public place where you can push and pull Docker images. And I'll explain what Docker images are, but it's basically like a public registry. So in my example before, when I said you can push your box to a registry, that's what Docker Hub is. And then the other one I want to point out is Data Center. And that's a kind of a relatively new product that Docker has put out that lets you essentially have a registry on your on-premises. So if you're an enterprise and you're using Docker, obviously you don't want to push your images to a public place. You want to have a place where you can have private images. So that's what Docker Data Center allows you to do. And recently, Azure actually released an integration with Data Center where you can, in a few clicks, you can have Docker Data Center running in Azure, have your own private Docker registry. All right, so then on the right are some of the tools. Docker Engine, that's kind of what people commonly think about when they think about Docker in the command line. That's what is building your containers and doing that for you. Docker Swarm is an orchestration service. So that's like a whole nother side of Docker, is when you can orchestrate multiple servers running Docker, and Swarm kind of combines those into one, so you can act like it's one Docker engine. And that's actually like a really competitive space right now. There's a lot of different companies, including Docker, that are trying to be like the go-to orchestration product. And then the two others I want to point out, first one, Docker Machine. Maybe like a few months ago, if you were experimenting with Docker like on your Windows laptop or your Mac laptop, you probably used Docker Machine. Again, since Docker is a Linux technology, you need like a Linux installed on your machine. But what Docker Machine does is it has VirtualBox underneath, so it kind of manages the VirtualBox environment for you, so then you can use Docker on your Windows or Mac laptop. And then Compose lets you take several different containers and link them together. So if I have like a web app container and I have a container that's running my database, Docker Compose lets me link those together so they can talk to one another. Okay. All right, so that's Docker, the ecosystem, like at a high level. All right, now I want to go into like some of the terms that you hear with Docker and kind of how they all relate to each other. So if you're using Docker and you want to build an image and run a container, it all starts with a Docker file. And that's what you write. It's just a simple file that's a series of instructions that builds layers and tells the Docker engine how to build your image. So once you use the Docker build command, then you have an image. And I put the .NET Foundation picture up there because if you go on Docker Hub, you can check out there's the .NET image, there's a Node image, there's like Postgres images, Redis, all kinds of like open source projects all have images up on Docker Hub that you can download. So once you have your image, you can run into a container using Docker run, or you can push that off to a registry from when you can then pull that down and run into a container. So really, this is how I like to think of it, is a Docker file is kind of like your source. If you're like building like an executable, a Docker file is like your source. An image is kind of like your binary or your executable that you've built. And then a container is like the actual running executable. So that's kind of an analogy that helps me think about this. Okay, and then this is just a zoomed up image of a Docker file. It's actually the Docker file that we'll be using in our demo. So I just wanted to show this in a little bit more detail. And say when you're writing a Docker file, the first instruction is always the from my base image. So you always need to start at some base image that already exists from when you can build on more layers. So in this case, we're going to be using the .NET image. Then we'll set some environment variables. We'll copy our source into the container. We'll set our working directory, run .NET restore, expose a port, and then run our app. Cool. Does anybody have any questions before I go on just about the background of Docker? Is it making more sense? Cool. Yeah.
You may cover this later. If you have like multiple tiers in your application, like a web tier and an application tier behind it,
Yeah.
would you, how would those talk to each other? Would you run those both on the same host machine, or would you run them on separate host machines?
Yeah, so that's where Docker Compose can come in. So you can have, you could have like one web service in one container, and then you could have another running somewhere else, or even like I like to use the example of a database, just because that's kind of familiar. So if I have my web app running here, and it depends on my database to run, I can use Docker Compose, and it will set up the networking between those two containers, so that they can be running on the same host, or they could actually be running on different servers too. So it's kind of up to you. But really, at the end of the day, if you're using Docker and you're exposing the right ports, like if you're going to communicate over HTTP or something like that, it's really like if you expose the ports, it's really no different than just running a regular, just running your app regularly without Docker. Is that?
Does each container get its own host name or IP address?
Yeah. So when you spin up a Docker container, you can give it a name if you want, or Docker will just like come up with like a random hash of a host name for you. Yeah. Cool. All right. Does anybody remember this from Build a few years ago? Satya was up in front, and it was like when the new Microsoft was coming out, and Microsoft is into open source, and Microsoft hearts Linux, and I think this was when ASP.NET 5 was first announced, and it was going to be on cross-platform, Linux, Mac OS, Windows. So this is like the part of my talk where I want to start saying why should you care about Docker as an ASP.NET developer? And really the reason is Docker is an industry trend, and I like to say like Docker is coming to an ASP.NET project near you. Microsoft is investing heavily into containers and Linux, getting their ecosystem to run cross-platform. So I put just a few links to articles and statistics that you can check out. First one is 1 in 3 VMs in Azure are now running Linux. There was recently announced the Azure Container Service, so you can spin that up in Azure, and that will kind of make it easier for you to set up the orchestration that I was talking about earlier. So that's now a product in Azure. Like I said earlier, you can get Docker Data Center running in Azure in a few clicks. And then the last one, I think back in March, the SQL Server team announced that SQL Server now runs in Linux, which means you can run it in a Docker container. And then another one that I didn't put on there that we were talking about before is in Windows Server, I think 2016, right? There's going to be containerization technology baked in, so you can now run, instead of just Linux Docker containers, you can have a Windows Server Docker container. I haven't messed around with that yet, but that's coming. And then that statistic down at the bottom, Northbridge Partners Survey, 76%, 1,400 companies plan to use containerization in 2016. Okay, so now, before ASP.NET Core hit, all the stuff with Docker, it really wasn't possible. If you're running ASP.NET, it really wasn't possible for you to use unless you were going to use Mono, because Docker is a Linux technology. But now, Microsoft has gone to the great extent of making .NET Core cross-platform and ASP.NET Core cross-platform. So now that's really unlocked the whole Docker ecosystem to .NET developers. So in case you haven't been following along with the developments, I created this timeline because there's been a lot of changes and it's been kind of hard to follow, especially with all the name changes. So way back in May of 2014, ASP.NET vNext was announced. And, there's a lot of buzz. It's going to be cross-platform, all that great stuff. It's going to be open source. And then it was given the name ASP.NET 5 in February 2015. And then November, the first release candidate was released. And then you had, over here, we had these command line tools for running ASP.NET 5 apps. You had DNVM, DNU, DNX. And I just mentioned those because then in RC2, those went away, and now what you have is the .NET CLI. So then in January of this year, RC2 was released, and now a few weeks ago, full .NET Core and ASP.NET Core version 1s were released. And they were actually released at Red Hat's developer conference. So how crazy is that like the flagship Microsoft product is announced and released at essentially like a Linux conference? Pretty crazy. So I was saying earlier that a project that I'm working on at work, we jumped on at RC1. So we're still using all these DNVM and DNU and DNX. So it's going to be a little tough for us to migrate, but I think we can do it. Cool. All right, so that's all the slides I have for now. Are there any questions before I go into demo? No? All right. All right. So first thing I want to show, let me get my display mirrored here. Cool. Okay. So first thing I want to show is if you want to start playing around with Docker, and you want to start playing around with .NET Core, let's just walk through that. So the place you want to go is you want to go to microsoft.com/net/core. It'll take you to this page, and they will walk you through instructions on installing .NET Core on your Windows, Linux, or Mac. But also, they have this Docker support. So we can go see what they say there. You can follow these links, and you can get Docker set up on your laptop before going further. But they say, hey, you can just run our Microsoft.NET image, and then you can use the .NET CLI, initialize some code, and run it. So we can go through that. If you want to see, here's the .NET Core image up on Docker Hub. So that's where you'd go to just check it out. You can see the Docker file, or maybe not. All right. And another, I guess, before I go too much further, a little disclaimer. I'm going to be doing these demos on my Mac, and I'm going to be using a lot of the command line. And I know probably that might not be comfortable for everybody, but I think it'll be helpful because I think it's a little bit like Git. So when you're using Git, you can use the GUI tools, but I think your understanding grows so much more when you are comfortable with the command line. So I think it's kind of the same with Docker. All right. So I have Docker installed on my machine, so I can run some commands. This Docker PS, that'll tell me if I have any containers running. It'll list those out for me. I don't have any running right now. Let's say Docker images. That lists out all the images I have. It looks a little funky because my display is zoomed in. But let's go and say what they, delete that. All right, so this is the command that they said to run. Docker run -it Microsoft.NET latest. The TAC IT, what that'll do is it'll run that container and it'll attach a terminal onto it. So then it's essentially like I'm SSH'd into a Linux server. I can run commands inside of my container. So I do that, and here I am. I'm root at that hash, and that's like the host name. That's the hash that Docker comes up with. So here I am. I'm inside this Linux container, and it has the .NET command already installed and ready to go. You can see the info and the version. You can see the version of the OS I'm running. So this container, the image that Microsoft is using using Debian. All right. So let's create our first .NET app. I'm going to make a folder. It's empty. You can say .NET new. So now I've got just a really simple program there. All it's going to do is spit out hello world. So I can say .NET restore. Good, it looks like my internet connection is still there. And that will restore and then run. And I get hello world. So that's really cool. Now what happens if I want to edit my program? Because I'm inside this container, and I don't even have VI or Vim or Emacs, which is all our favorite editors, right? Don't even have those. Yeah. So I could. Wait, I think it's sed is here. So if I wanted to do some stream editing, maybe I could do that. If you're who needs Visual Studio when you have sed? Okay, but that's silly. Also, I mean, it's a Linux container, so I could use apt-get if I want, and I could install an editor, but that's not what you want to do. Instead, all right, so I just exited out of that running container. This time, I'm going to add a -v, so that is setting up a volume. And what a volume is it takes your running container and it takes a directory from your host machine and maps it into your running container. So then whenever I change a file in that directory on my host machine, it's changed inside my container. And whenever I change it inside my container, it's changed inside on my host machine. So that way, I can run my container, I can have all my source, and I can change it as much as I want. It's going to run inside my container. So what I'm doing here is this $PWD, that's just going to spit out my current working directory. So the syntax here is -v, on the left side is the host directory, right side of the colon is where my container, the container directory. Okay, so let's do that. cd into app. It's right here. Let me open up. Sorry. Okay. Let's run .NET restore, .NET run. Okay, so we got our hello world back. Now if I want to go in and I want to edit my app, I'm using Visual Studio Code here. So I can go in here, move this up, say hello .NET user group. Save that. .NET run. And now it changed. Cool. So when I was talking earlier in that continuous delivery workflow, and I was talking about you have your container and it's like this box, and everything is standardized inside that box, but you can change your host files and then they run inside the container. That's what I'm doing here. I've got a running container, but I also have the host on my host system, I have all the source files that I'm running there. So theoretically, I wouldn't even need the .NET tools installed on my host machine. I could just run them inside Docker. So this could really be valuable, like on your team, if if a new developer walks in and they have to have a fresh laptop and they have to install like all the tools that your team needs to get going. In this kind of environment, as long as they have Docker and your system is oriented around that, theoretically then I could install Docker and I could be good to go and I could write code. All I need is a text editor. Cool. All right. Does anybody have any questions on that? That's the, yeah.
So is Docker just a development tool, or do you actually run production in Docker eventually?
Yes, it's production too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you always need to remote into your container, or there is a way to, say compile or whatever without actually remote into your container?
Yeah, definitely. Let me see if I can show you that. Actually, yes, I can show you that with the next example. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
How would the application live in Docker?
So,
Like the continuation of this question, so if I want to deploy an application, where would it live? Is there something like IIS, is there other server inside it? Or?
yeah, so in the case of ASP.NET Core, there's a new web server called Kestrel that you don't need IIS. It's like a self-hosted. So IIS, since it doesn't run in Linux, you won't use that in Docker. But instead, if you're going to use, yeah.
Windows containers has
Yeah.
IIS.
Yeah, so you could, yeah. So when Windows containers come, then you can have IIS and you can be running it that way. Mm-hmm.
Is Kestrel compatible, or are there differences between all of those?
Yeah, it's a lot more lightweight. So think of it, it's kind of like, I like to think of it as it's basically like a Node web server where it's just, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can you run GUI apps inside Docker and have the UI show up on your host machine? Because you mentioned running an editor inside Docker.
Yeah.
Or would that just be for console stuff?
I think you probably could. I'm not sure on that. I have to do some research. But I do know there's some kind of consumer apps that they ship it with Docker. So for example, there's one called, it's not a GUI per se, but there's one called Rocket Chat. It's like a Slack, open source Slack competitor. And they actually ship as a Docker container that you just run on your server. But I'm not sure about just a desktop app running, because it's kind of more oriented towards developers. Yeah, might have to do some research on that. That's a good question. Oh, yeah. Still running. Ah, there we go. Okay. Close call. Okay. So.
Maybe you'll get to it, but what about debugging?
Yeah, that's a good question. The Visual Studio tooling for Docker. So and I have a link to it later. There's actually, so you can install it in Visual Studio 2015. You right click, you say add Docker support. It adds a Docker file for you, all that. And you hit F5 and you can debug inside your container. There's the same thing on OS 10 with Visual Studio Code, and I've been playing around with it. I haven't gotten it to work yet, but it's almost there. Yeah. It's tricky because you have to do remote debugging basically, and you have to add the debugger into the container. So yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's make sure I'm still connected. Um,
Fight with that all day. You just kind of use mine.
huh?
Yeah. Hotspot. You just
Oh, nice. Okay. Hotspot.
That's my iPad.
That one?
Yep.
Oh, thank you. Nice.
Okay.
See.
Leave those up there.
Thanks, Marcus.
Might disappear.
Let's see if that gets going. And got it. Cool. All right. So I made this play app for us to kind of show some of these tools off. It's called GIF Roulette, and if you're at my work we use Slack. Does anybody else use Slack at work? So you're familiar with like the Giphy command. So you say Giphy, and then you say like some keyword, and it just spits back like a random GIF for you. And it just comes back with like the most hilarious stuff sometimes. So I used the Giphy API and kind of made the same thing here. So let me zoom in. It's very simple. Oop. All you do is you type, so I've typed Microsoft, hit spin, and then we get a random picture. I don't know. I was playing around with this, and I got one where it was Bill Gates, and he was like jumping over a chair at an interview. It was awesome. But yeah, so you can keep doing this. You'll get a different Giphy. All right. Oh my. Okay. So let's close that. Don't save. Recent. Okay, so this is the code. It's an ASP.NET Core app, very simple. Only has one controller, a few models, and a few views. What I want to show you is here is the Docker file I'm using. So I'm going to start at, can you guys see that in the back, by the way? Okay. So I'm going to start with that Microsoft base image again. And I'll copy all my source files into the container. I'll set my working directory. I'll run .NET Restore. And then I'll use this cool utility that the team came up with, .NET Watch Run. So it's pretty cool. You use .NET Watch and then the command, and it'll watch your source, and it'll actually like reload anytime you make a change. So, and then also, just a little quick demo, I added a Docker Compose file. So this is, even though I only have one service, I'm going to use Docker Compose to declare my ports and set up my volume, and then set up a few environment variables. That's really huge. Okay. All right. So the command I just used was Docker Compose up. And when I issue that command, Docker Compose, it'll go through here. It sees this build. And what that means is that dot says, like, the Docker file that I want you to use is actually in this directory. So grab that Docker file and build it. So I can go out. To localhost, and then I have the same thing here, cat. So now we can get some cat pictures. Okay. So that's great for development, because then, so I was talking about that .NET Watch. I can go in here into my controller. Let's say I want to like add some view data. Save it. And then actually over here, you can kind of, it's hard to tell, but it saw that change and now it's going to reload. So it saw the change from my volume into the container and it reloaded. So let's actually put that into the view. Copy this. Add view data. Test data. Is that what I called it? My test data. Okay, save that. It'll reload again. It comes back. Now you see my hi there. Okay. All right. Okay, so then, so that's the development process. Hopefully that makes sense. So then going to production. So you can see here, I have a Docker file, but I also have this Docker file production. And that's because the way you build your app and when you're developing, especially when you're debugging, is probably different from the way you want to run it when it's in production, obviously. So you can see some of the differences here, where here I'm restoring and then I'm like actually running it. The difference in this, when I'm going to production, I'm going to use the .NET publish command, which is just going to completely build my app and all its dependencies and dump it into a folder. And then I'll use the .NET command to run the DLL that it builds. Likewise, I have this Docker Compose production YAML where you can see I've changed the ports. So now I'm on port 80. And instead of here, before I had a build command with a dot, now I'm saying use this image that you're going to find on Docker Hub. So what I'll do is when I push to my source control, and I'll show you this in a minute, but I'll push to my source control, and then my CI will pick that up. It'll build my image, push it to Docker Hub, and then it'll tell my server that, hey, the newest image is ready. Go ahead, pull it down, and run it. So actually, when I'm running on my server, I don't even need like any of my source files. All I need is this Docker Compose, and it'll go and grab the image off of Docker Hub.
Question. So can you do the same for example, some other image provider like your company internal or whatever?
Yeah, definitely. So if you had like a private registry, you could say, this in your Docker config, you could say like, don't use Docker Hub. Whenever I call out an image, go grab it from my private registry, or push, instead of pushing to Docker Hub, push to the private registry.
What should I use for creating such private registries?
That, you can use the Docker Data Center is a product that you can use from Docker, and that will come with the trusted registry that you can set up on your on-premises environment. Mm-hmm. All right. So we can see, let's get out of that. Okay, so we can see I'm using Git. I have a few changes here. Let's add those. Made some changes. And we'll push. All right. So then, as an example, you all can see that. I'm using Circle CI, but you could really use any, as long as your CI has a build agent that has Docker installed in it, you could use Jenkins, you can use Visual Studio Team Services, you can use TeamCity. As long as your CI understands Docker, your CI can build your image for you. And I'm using CircleCI because they have Docker integration just bundled in, and it's really easy to get started. So we can see now my CI is running. Maybe it's going to be in the queue. Let's go to one that I already built. So these are the steps it went through. It checked out the code, started Docker. Right here is where it built my image for me. You can see I specified my production Docker file. And then I told it the tag is JOrder GIF roulette latest. So it built that. And then it went down, and here it pushed the image to Docker Hub. So then I can see, if I go to my profile, whoa. Okay. Whoa. It's going to push it into my, like my one of my repositories on Docker Hub. It'll push it there for me. And then it'll run this, just this deploy script that I have that I can show you. And it's just going to SSH into the server that I have running, and it'll pull down the latest Docker file. It's kind of hard to read. It'll pull down the latest image, transfer my Docker Compose file, run Docker Compose, and it's up and going. So if this will complete, we can see the change. If not, it might take a little while, because there's kind of a queue system with CircleCI. Yeah, any more questions? Yeah.
Is there a built-in way to spin up a second copy while the first copy's still running, and then switch over?
Yeah.
Like you do in Azure with the startup,
Yeah.
startup the staging and then swap?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's not a built-in with if you're using Docker Swarm or some of the other orchestration, there might be a built-in way, but I'm not too familiar, to be honest. So I'd have to do more research on that. That's a good question, though. I would think, though, that those tools would have something like that for you. Yeah. All right. I guess the upside is hopefully that, you know, the process of tearing down the old one and spinning up the new one is so fast that hopefully, but still, that's a feature that I'm sure is good. All right. Anything else? Any other questions? Cool. All right, so let's kick back over to the slides. This is a quote that I grabbed off of Docker's blog. It's from the CTO of a company called Splice. They're like a music sharing, like collaborative music composing kind of site. And what he's basically saying is before they used Docker, they had issues in all their environments using different versions of different software. But now, since they containerize everything, you know, they can be sure that everything's the same across every environment, across every developer. So that's really going back to that workflow that I presented at the start. So that's like really what has me so excited about using Docker in projects, is I want every project that I'm on to have this smooth, continuous delivery workflow where I can deploy easily and without problems. All right, so if you go grab these slides, here's some resources that I have where you can go check out some more information, some articles from DockerCon, which was just a few weeks ago, Docker Data Center in Azure, some documentation on Docker Compose and Swarm. This video is pretty good from some guys on the .NET team that they show deploying Docker containers with ASP.NET. So that's a good video to check out. And then these are the tooling that you can get in for Visual Studio. So you can, you know, right-click, and Visual Studio will kind of create your Docker file for you, manage all that debugging and stuff. And that's all I have. Again, I'd appreciate it if you guys could go check out that feedback form. Give me feedback that you have. I'd love to keep improving. And yeah, thanks for listening.